Number 5, put the fantasy back in Final Fantasy. Remember when I was talking about just having a mage, off to the side? I feel like those times are kind of gone. You can make it like a support troop, and you can send them out to do their own thing. However, I don't want a main story where I don't care about characters, right? So I feel like this is a bygone era, or rather, this should never be the focus anymore back in Final Fantasy. Not the fantasy part, but the idea that characters you hire or buy and they don't really mean anything and don't do anything. I don't know how that is next gen. I don't know how that is future thinking. If anything, that's just pulling Final Fantasy back to the past, and a franchise cannot live on just its core fan base. You always need to get new, fresh fans and ideas in. Final Fantasy 14 notwithstanding, Final Fantasy 14 is amazing, by the way. Square hasn't gone hardcore fantasy for their main franchise in some time. 2006's Final Fantasy 12 is the closest we've seen, which was well over a decade ago. Since then, Final Fantasy has flirted with the futuristic both in Final Fantasy 13 and 15, even if both games were far more fantastical than anything the real world could come up with. Final Fantasy 16 doesn't have to be traditional fantasy. It can and should draw on other traditional mythologies. However, with 7's remake on the way, it seems weird to push another game in the direction of the far future. To think that Midgar is really far future is totally incorrect. Final Fantasy VII is spot on. You just talk about Mako and call it nuclear energy. And if you don't think we're using nuclear energy like they're using Mako, you're totally wrong. And your perception of fantasy and reality and sci-fi is totally fucked. I do love the idea of returning to a fantasy route. However, I think they're equating fantasy to Skyrim. I think they're equating fantasy to an old Final Fantasy, very nostalgia filled right here. I don't think it's fair to not call Final Fantasy 8 or 15 or 13 fantasy. It's 100% fantasy. So this debate, again, it's only been really brought up because that director has said something about it. 4, better DLC. I just went on about saying how great the DLC for 15 was. Because of the way Square Enix release schedules have been, Final Fantasy 15 was the first time a mainline game has gotten to do DLC the way it's done in the modern era, and it was not the way DLC should be done. Hysterical. Offering the ability to play as the other characters in an already small party is not DLC. Okay, Square should take a page from both Ubisoft and CD Projekt Red to see what it means to truly add DLC to an existing game. Additional quests are good. New areas to explore with their own stories are always appreciated. Anything that seems additive rather than completing the game. Okay, what a small blurb and diss to Final Fantasy 15. And I called this out at the beginning of the intro of the show. Remember that. Playing as Gladio for the whole game is not DLC is absolutely ridiculous. That is the definition of DLC. A great idea to have, especially if you're playing the game for the first time. But where's the mention that each Prompto, Gladio, and Ignis each got a DLC, their own story, their own new spots on the map, new stuff for $5. Awesome DLC for $5. You cannot talk about DLC and just select the one little part that you dislike. You need to talk about the whole DLC, all of the DLC. And by the way, all the DLC would have been done by the time this article was written. So to not talk about all of the DLC for Final Fantasy 15 is absolutely just a sham. That's just a sham. And I'm only mentioning a small portion of it. But to not talk about Comrades being a 40-hour experience in and of itself. To not talk about the summons you've gotten, to the mode, to switch characters, the new abilities, I don't know what they want from DLC. I heard Blood and Wine for The Witcher was great. I played The Witcher, but I felt no need to get the DLC, right? Because it didn't. I knew that DLC was not actually going to add on to the story in a worthy and substantial amount for me to care. But see, what I did care about was why the hell did Gladio leave my party? What was he doing? Prompto. I just slashed the dude off the train. What is he doing? Right? DLC that asks a game that asks the player a question and plans this and decides to give me that answer in DLC form, I'm okay with, because everything can't fit on one disc anymore. Yes, I understand that only recently Final Fantasy VII is not doing multi-disc on its first run. I think it's 2 discs maybe, but it's not going to be a multi-disc game. They're not going to give it to us all at one time. They're going to release it over years. So to think that you're going to get a 4-disc PlayStation 4 game nowadays, that just isn't going to work. It worked on the PlayStation 1, but we can't compare that. So to say that, oh, they withheld the DLC to sell it as DLC, I think is not a genuine way to look at the world. And I understand it's a company, however, but it was clearly scripted in a good and meaningful way. So this argument is just total shit, because the other half of this argument is fuck DLC, don't put it in our games, and that's just not how it works anymore. And it's not. 3, not to be the only next generation Final Fantasy. Now, what they're showing here, this was a tech demo. This was nothing to do with Final Fantasy. This was just a tech demo, and people loved it, obviously. When it's all said and done, the only new mainline Final Fantasy the generation will have seen will be Final Fantasy 15. This is pretty much unprecedented, as every console generation before then received 3, and usually no less than 2. I agree and disagree with this. So, Final Fantasy 15, only one to technically release on the PlayStation 4. However, we have Final Fantasy VII coming out for the PlayStation 4. We've had multiple spin-offs on the PlayStation 4, particularly World of Final Fantasy, one of the most underrated Final Fantasy games that nobody wants to talk about as being good. It was great. So this is a very biased opinion here, unless we're talking about truly original titles in the mainline franchise, which there wasn't many then. You're talking about Final Fantasy 7 and 8 as original to the PlayStation 1, fuck 9. You're talking about 10, and you're talking about 10. That's all you're really talking about for the PlayStation 2, because if anything, I'd make the argument that Final Fantasy X looked better than Final Fantasy 12. In all honesty. So we'll give the PlayStation 2 more titles. I'm not giving you X2 because that's just a continuation, and it's easy to release a game that is a sequel and everything's already built for you. Go to the PlayStation 3. The only game I'm giving you there is Final Fantasy 13. It was a trilogy, and a shit trilogy at that. So you get Final Fantasy 13. Again, I'm staying mainline. And now you're going to the PlayStation 4. You got Final Fantasy 15, which is the most innovation that we've seen in a very long time for Final Fantasy in terms of what they're trying to do with their game. They shoved it down our throats with Final Fantasy 13. They basically said, you will like this. You will like this. And to be honest, it divided and killed a whole generation of fan bases, because we just didn't like it like that. It was not our trilogy. It was not the trilogy we wanted. If you were going to do the trilogy, you should have did it for 10, because you bought it, you got us bought into it in X2. If you had just closed it off right, fine. Hopefully that's still coming. And then Final Fantasy, PlayStation 4, 15, and now the 7 remake. I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure PlayStation 4 with the 7 remake and Final Fantasy 15 will be the best 2, Final Fantasy console drops together, console per Final Fantasy game that there would have been. Because, like I said, we all have our personal favorites, but I think we can all agree that you're going to cut out the PlayStation 3 run of Final Fantasy and just say, trash. You're going to cut out 1, maybe 2 games from the PlayStation 1, because honestly, no one can really replay and go back to play those games anymore. They're just old and dated. Great, understand nostalgia. However, no new player is going to do that. I don't understand this statement at all. In a world where other developers are working on their flagship titles concurrently, it would be nice if Square afforded their main series the same courtesy. No. While they're still hyping the Final Fantasy XVI, they should really be working on Final Fantasy XVII. It would be nice to see releases of several games staggered out every 2 years, allotting longtime fans to get their fix. This is incorrect because longtime fans will get their fix by playing a world of Final Fantasy. They'll be playing, a remaster of Final Fantasy VIII. They'll be playing. There's so many titles. I just can't list it. This is 100% wrong though. To say that you want, every 2 years, it's just not enough to make real art and everything. Think about how long it took Death Stranding to come out. Think about Last of Us 2, how long it comes out. Final Fantasy is and always should and remain to be the product before the consumer. This is a consumer who wants the consumer attitude. Go get the spin-offs. Go get some of those other titles. They're great as well. I'm not gonna knock the spin-offs here. However, no thanks, because no thanks. I don't need this to be Call of Duty. Final Fantasy is not Call of Duty, doesn't have the reputation of Call of Duty, and I never want it to get to that point where people are saying we get a new Final Fantasy every year, every 2 years. Fuck that. That's not the way to go.
Yo, it's the Grown Kid Talk Show.